2,000 years ago, setting sail from Rome's southernmost port of Berenike in Egypt, the world of trade began. Emporiums dotting the Red Sea coast provided the empire with a lucrative trading economy, sailing around Arabia into India, where you could then trade with China and the further east. Rome's connections with China, while rare, were well documented. These two empires saw each other as hubs of the world to the east and the west, at least when they spared a thought for each other at all. And this was, for the most part, true. The connections of the Silk Road through Asia have gone back millennia, as I've discussed in several videos. But there is a whole other world that this narrative misses. What happened if you kept going south? What would you have seen in Africa?
Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the Archaeologist, now let's get into the travels.
We can name dozens of ports from this time period across India and Arabia, and even a couple in China that the Romans knew about. But there were only a small handful in Africa. This was because, at least in part, most of Africa beyond Ethiopia was not urbanized, and many populations were semi-nomadic, so ports that did exist tended to be set up by outsiders. But ports did nevertheless exist, allowing ships to hop along the east coast for trading purposes. And the southernmost terminus of this route was the port of Rhapta. Rhapta was not an easy place to get to from Rome. A trader setting out from Egypt in July would not reach the port until November, and then they'd be obliged to wait there until fairer winds could sail them back north the following summer. It took 18 months on a round trip from Berenike, and it was not for the faint-hearted. It's not certain when this port emerged, and when or why it fell into decline, or exactly where it was. While there are hints from other sources, almost everyone agrees it was located in Tanzania, no one really agrees where in Tanzania Rhapta was. For this reason, Rhapta is known as Africa's Atlantis. The most likely location seems to be the delta of the Rufiji River, at least partially because the people of the area were called by the Roman records Refugii. It is also identified as 1 or 2 days sailing beyond the Manuthias Islands, identified variously as Zanzibar, Mafia, Pemba, or the Lamu Archipelago in Kenya. Some have even gone so far as to suggest that it was Madagascar, but I think that one is just a little too far south and a bit too big to fit the descriptions. It should also be noted that Rhapta was not operated by locals, but by a vassal of the Himyarites, who used it as a source of tortoise shell and soft ivory. For those of you who don't know, the Himyarites were a Judeo-Arab kingdom existing in modern-day Yemen. They are worthy of a video or two in their own right, but long story short, since they controlled the source of many spices and the Bab al-Mandeb, they were a very wealthy merchant kingdom. They liked trading, and this means they connected to a lot of the world as a result. That being the case, why did the Himyarites have a vassal at Rhapta? Ivory and tortoiseshell could easily come from other nearer ports and didn't need such a long travel time. Indeed, while Rhapta was prized for its tortoiseshell and hailed as a more reliable source of soft ivory after sources in the north became endangered, records suggest that India was still selling these goods and at maybe even a higher quality. Well, this is because Rhapta still had something to offer, and there was more going on here than the trade of just a couple of luxury items. This is part of a larger question. What exactly are we looking for? Was Rhapta an emporium or a metropolis? Emporiums are little more than small outposts, while metropolis are huge and important centers. But even an emporium, if it stands alone, can grow over the centuries. As the round trip from Egypt to Rhapta was 18 months, with sailors needing to overwinter there, it needed accommodation for them. It also needed to feed them and clothe them, they needed translators, local guides, and so on. Even a small emporium risks sprawling out into a large suburb. And at the end of all this, it had to turn a profit. Which leads us to the question of what did Rhapta have to offer? Who was this trade being conducted with, and what else were they offering? Now, you probably expect me to bring up Great Zimbabwe here. Well, you're kind of on the right track, but we're about 1,000 years too early for that. While there was agriculture and metalworking beginning in Zimbabwe, and its inhabitants may have been able to reach Rhapta from the south, there was quite enough going on in Tanzania for this video, which is what I want to talk about today. Now, here is where we turn to archaeology, because historical records on what lay beyond Rhapta are slim. Not non-existent per se, but slim. And archaeological information itself is scant because, as you can imagine, there's not a lot of archaeology done in Sub-Saharan Africa, relative to the rest of the world, and what is done is usually associated with human evolution. It is also, unfortunately, hamstrung by a lot of colonial baggage. The way we think about pre-colonial Africa and how we study their history and archaeology is rapidly evolving, especially as Africans get involved in it themselves and we untangle past assumptions made under colonial structures. Many papers, in fact, only note environment and artifacts in list form these days in order to avoid any misinterpretation. There's still a long way to go and a lot of research to conduct. That's basically a really pretentious way to tell you that I have no idea that this video is up to date from here on out, because what we think we know is continually being challenged and rewritten. It's possible that they discovered something new yesterday after I finished recording, or tomorrow after I posted and this video will be out of date, but I'm going to do the best I can and in good faith, so bear with me. The first piece of archaeology to discuss must be the proposed site of Rhapta itself. Researchers from the University of Dar es Salaam, led by Professor Felix Chami, claimed to have discovered Rhapta near the mouth of the Rufiji, citing, among other things, pottery and radiocarbon dates from the 1st century. Ruins were discovered in 2016 at Mafia Island, specifically at Kole Bay, which is across the strait from the Rufiji River, by the way. The ruins were flooded by time and a bit small, but they certainly excited the community, so much so that Tanzania has even applied to give them UNESCO status under the assumption that these ruins are Rhapta. There will almost definitely be more about this coming up in the future, which could confirm this interpretation or blow holes in it. See, Chami began his Rhapta excavations in 2019, and these publications have only been coming out since 2021. In academic terms, this is very recent, so as of right now, we're quite literally taking Chami's word for it. It's also clear that Tanzania has a political and social interest in this being Rhapta. Now, this doesn't mean that the conclusion can't be trusted or that the work wasn't done properly. In fact, I can't find anything to suggest it wasn't. But it's worth noting from an objective standpoint that there is still work to be done to see if this conclusion holds water, or if all the involved parties are getting a little ahead of themselves. But I find this fascinating in either case because this research is done by the universities of Dar es Salaam and Dodoma, not just Western schools. Too often, archaeology is written off as a discipline for the wealthy or a colonial exercise, but as with all sciences, it is a tool. Archaeology done wrong in pursuit of an ideology can, and indeed has in the past, been colonial. But used properly, it can be used as a way to reclaim your own heritage from these forces in the past that saw it destroyed or replaced by slanted narratives. It can be a force for anti-colonialism, and this is exactly what is being done here. Speaking of trying to do archaeology properly, hit the like and subscribe for more stuff like this. I love shining a spotlight on lesser-known aspects of history, and if I know you like hearing about it, I'll make more. Comment, too, if you have a suggestion for a future video. Beyond Rhapta lay the wider continent, which the Romans knew as Azania and the Chinese knew as Zesan. Most of our surviving records of Azania come from Pliny the Elder, the 1st century Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, and from Claudius Ptolemy. From China, there is only one real account of Zesan, also from the 3rd century, from the Wei Lu. Interestingly, the Chinese reports that Rhapta was Roman, likely due to the influence of Roman technology being used to build it up. But the Romans at the time still considered it a Himyarite port. In addition, archaeology shows us that Madagascar at the time was being colonized by Austronesians, these guys. So it's possible that Rhapta's trade went further than either the Romans or the Chinese were aware of. After all, if they could reach Madagascar from Indonesia, it's not outlandish to suggest that they could reach Rhapta from Madagascar as well. Azania may have had tortoiseshell and ivory, but it was also a place where the peoples of the ancient world met and traded in close quarters with each other, and evidence of all these cultures has been found along Tanzania's coast, with both Roman coinage and Indian pottery being found at Tanga and on Pemba. Greek, Phoenician, and Indian goods were found in the Rufiji Delta along with Asian-sourced coconuts and rice on Zanzibar. Through this, we can safely say that Rhapta was acting as more than just a terminus of trade, it was also a meeting point of cultures from the Far East and the Far West. But there is more to the story. Claudius Ptolemy recounts the tale of a Greco-Roman explorer named Diogenes, no, different guy, not him, who went inland for 25 days from Rhapta and claimed to have found the source of the Nile, describing there being the snow-capped mountains of the moon and 2 great lakes. Now, for anyone familiar with African geography, this sounds remarkably like Kilimanjaro and the Rwenzori Mountains near the Tanzanian-Ugandan border, along with Lake Victoria and probably some second Great Lake, probably one of these ones. And this is indeed where the Nile draws its source. And I don't have to tell you, this is just a little more than exciting. But it gets even more interesting than this, because when we look deeper, we see that Diogenes, far from forging his own path, was probably following a long-established one. According to Pliny the Elder, eastern goods such as cinnamon and cassia were actually transported inland from Rhapta to the source of the Nile, where it was transported up overland into Egypt. This was believed to be a faster and safer route than by the sea, and at the time, it probably was. As to how these traders were able to go so far inland, this may have been through the Mikomatsi corridor along the modern-day border of Kenya and Tanzania. This has always served as a migration corridor for wildlife and as such a draw for nomadic hunters, as well as, importantly, trading caravans. Such easy routes also meant that urban ports could not only maintain their communication with the hinterland, but exert political power over the people who lived there. Archaeological evidence suggests that compact, centralized local chiefdoms had emerged across the East African coast at this time, probably consolidating power at least partially through control of these coastal roads. They likely held enough power to control the flow of local goods, in this case tortoiseshell and ivory, the foreigners so prized, and used it to prop up their own power structures. But of course all of this was fluid, and who these people were was changing significantly. Africa was experiencing a great period of movement and migration. The Bantu people had begun expanding from up here, and by the 1st century CE they seem to have reached East Africa, although there is some debate about that. I've found contradictory sources saying both there is wide agreement they were Bantu and it is certain they were not Bantu, so I don't know, man. See previous disclaimer. I think these days we lean towards these people being Bantu, but yeah, don't hold me to that. In either case, the Bantu were either about to enter Tanzania or had just recently entered it, so anyway, period of great change regardless. And whether they were Bantu or not, it doesn't change the evidence from this time period. According to the University of Dodoma, the locals who lived west of Lake Victoria, usually linked with the ancestors of the Haya people, but you know how I feel about making these ethnic assumptions, were making carbon steel. This is a sign of a sophisticated understanding in metallurgy that, at the time, only the great empires of Eurasia could match. This is also around where Diogenes would have ended up, and where Pliny the Elder claimed eastern goods were being shipped, assuming that both accounts are reliable. So what we have here is a beautiful example of scant historical records and scant archaeology actually lining up to form something incredibly interesting. The people of the interior presumably gained great wealth as middlemen, knowing both the road to the coast and to the Nile. Roman coins were found mixed among pottery from Lake Victoria at Tanga, further cementing this idea of trade caravans linking the two regions. In fact, the more I studied this, the more I wondered if Rhapta was at Tanga or Dar es Salaam, and these ruins at Mafia were an outpost still further south that the Romans didn't even know about. It's only idle speculation from me, of course, and I'm not staking my reputation on that. But don't get the wrong idea either. Despite Rhapta's nickname of Africa's Atlantis, this was not some ancient lost city of marble. The port of Rhapta and other ports to the north of it, in modern-day Kenya and Somalia, were controlled by Himyarites, not by locals. Even then, it is wrong to think of them as cities. Rhapta may have just been a small emporium, but even if a town grew out of it or on the mainland throughout the centuries, it would have only been a major port in relative terms. Even at its height, Rhapta would have been dwarfed by even the smaller ports of the north. To locals, it would have been a bustling metropolis of wealth and international trade, but to foreign merchants it would have been the last outpost on the end of the world. It is also clear that local African ports beyond Ethiopia were on undeveloped land that the Romans and Arabs considered tribal and uncivilized. The people on the coast of Azania, in particular, are described as cave dwellers. East Africa was still a few hundred years away from building their own local empires and massive economic centers, and while we don't know anything much about the region beyond this in the 1st century, we still know that the idea that foreign empires could only come here as conquerors or colonizers is false. The Himyarites simply could not impose their will on locals the way the Europeans did 1600 years later. You needed local cooperation, or else the guys you sent to build your port will have a very bad time with local resistance, especially if you're a long way from home and getting supplies to them isn't easy. And this may be why there were so few ports in Africa. Many local tribes simply weren't interested in cooperating. You needed a friendly stretch of coast with a decent harbor where you could build undisturbed and enough local help to give you supplies. So, East Africans obviously had some agency here. They may not have had their own developed ports or local empires, but such concepts were not alien to them either. These ports can only exist as long as both sides see them as a benefit. If merchants don't get a return on investment or locals start to feel they're too imposing, the port will decline very quickly. And maybe this is what happened to Rhapta. Maybe the trouble of maintaining it proved too expensive. Maybe the locals found foreign merchants too imposing. Or maybe it's more complicated than that. We know that both Rome and China experienced domestic turbulence in the 3rd century, causing their economies to shrink and trade along with it. The Himyarites were conquered by the Ethiopians in the 6th century, and the Ethiopians had their own access routes to this region with different economic goals. Environmental change also appears as a possible factor. Any one of these things had the potential to lead to Rhapta's decline, let alone a combination of them, but we don't know for sure which it was. After the 3rd century, we never hear of it again. Indian records from the 7th century suggest that trade with Tanzania was still ongoing, but Rhapta itself is not mentioned. There is no hint of turmoil. Rhapta simply vanished, swallowed up by time and by the sea. Or maybe it was just abandoned as locals evolved their own trade infrastructure. Because the trade routes never quite disappeared, even if the port did. These connections evolved and developed further, regardless of Rhapta, and by the medieval era, it had turned it into the famed Swahili coast. Rhapta was more than an emporium on the edge of the map. It was a link to the mighty empires of the north, a source of wealth and knowledge, and the guiding light towards a future where East Africans were not the end of someone else's world, but the beginning of their own. Anyway, that's all I have to say on Rhapta for today. I will almost certainly return to Sub-Saharan Africa in the future because there's a lot to talk about in this area. And until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.